Dr. Sherri Tenpenny, I don't want to say the man, the myth, the legend, the woman, the myth, the legend. So when I first started questioning vaccines back in 2016, just after I commissioned as an officer in the Army, graduated from West Point, and was fully indoctrinated into a government paradigm, series of events happened with my family that led me to start questioning things with respect to health. And when I started questioning vaccines, some of the first people that I came across were you, Dr. Larry Pilevsky, shout out to Dr. P, love him. And then I think it was Dr. Tony Bark at the time, and rest in peace to Dr. Tony Bark. She did a lot of incredible work in this paradigm. But I want to give you a lot of credit for my initial entry into this space, and it is pretty surreal to have you now sitting across from me and having a chat. And you gave me a signed copy of your new book, Zero Accountability in a Failed System: How Big Pharma Weaponizes Vaccines, Public Health, and the Law. And you can find this in the show notes. And I just want to thank you so much for all your work over the years and for being here and sitting with me for this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Alec. You know, before we started, we talked about Austin. It's a big place for people that don't know, had ever been here. You drive for an hour to get. So when people say they live in Austin, I think the question is, what part of Austin do you live in? Because it's a big place down here.
It is a helpful qualifying statement to say, hey, I live in the Austin area, but that also means I live about an hour, 10 minutes away from Austin or whatever it is. And I've had guests come out who then appear on Luke Story's podcast or Dave Asprey's podcast or Josh Trent's podcast later that day. Or, you know, in your case, you're going on another podcast right after this. And they get here and they're like, you say you're in the Austin area. I'm like, well, yeah, I am in the Austin area. And they're like, well, so does this other guy, but his studio is an hour, 20 minutes away from yours. So what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
So I guess we just need to be a little bit more specific about where exactly that is. So before we begin this episode, I just want to sort of frame the conversation for those who are listening and watching. Obviously, if you tune into my work often, you know my position on virology, and you can check that out, episode 141. I do not want to get into that in this conversation. That is not the intention of this conversation. The intention of this episode with Dr. Tenpenny, because like when I first came across questioning vaccines for the first time, turning towards good resources for those who are just beginning to question these things, Dr. Tenpenny is one of the best people for that, honestly. She really is. And so the purpose of this is to sort of act as a vaccine 101 sort of style discussion and interview. I consider myself to be quite knowledgeable on this, but she's been doing this for a long time when it comes to vaccines. So I'm excited to be able to pick her brain and have her fill in the gaps in some of my knowledge on the vaccine paradigm. And again, this episode will be incredibly useful to send to family members, loved ones, coming from the mouths of an expert, from a credentialed expert, a DO, right? Doctor of osteopathy. Okay. A DO. I think this will be a very helpful episode to send people. So I'd like to start with you sort of just sharing your process in discovering the problems with vaccines initially as someone who went to medical school. So.
Well, I grew up in a chiropractic family. My grandfather, my father, 3 uncles, and 2 cousins were chiropractors. So I was not vaccinated at all as a child. You know, I grew up on Shackley vitamins and regular adjustments and so I had measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, had pertussis twice. My dad had, his father was a chiropractor and he had gone to the Korean War, and he said he was never so sick in his entire life than when he got all those shots when he got into the war. And when he got out, he and my mom got married in 1956. I was born in 1958, which tells you how old I am. I've been around a long time. And that was when, the polio vaccine came out in 1954. And in the chiropractic literature, there was a lot of stuff that was being published about children who became paralyzed or had a flaccid limb or something like that after getting a polio vaccine. And so when I was born, those two things together, my dad being sick after getting all those shots, and then he was seeing in the chiropractic literature, he and my mom made the decision I was not going to be vaccinated, and I wasn't. And it was interesting because I lived in a very small town in kind of north central Ohio. There was about 800 people in the population. And we had a local family doctor who made an appointment one day to come in and talk to my dad in his office. And he said, "You've got to get a handle on your wife." And he's like, "Why?" And he said, "Well, she has to vaccinate your child." And my dad physically picked him up and threw him out of his office and went on a campaign to get him run out of town, which he did.
In true chiropractic fashion, by the way.
In true chiropractic fashion. My dad was about 6'2" and really buffed up. And so he was a good looking man when he was younger. Well, when he was older too, but especially when he was younger. So I never gave it a second thought. At anything. I mean, we raised horses when I was growing up, and, everybody's so afraid about tetanus and horses, and it was never a big deal to me. Went to medical school, graduated from medical school, and we got no training at all about vaccines. I mean, in fact, at that point in time, there was, up until 1985, there's only 3 vaccines: polio, MMR, and DPT. So, I mean, what was there to talk about? And so they didn't really talk about any of that stuff. When I graduated from medical school, I went into emergency medicine, and I gave out zillions of tetanus shots like they were some special kind of candy. Never read a package insert, never anything at that point in time, because why? It's safe and effective, right? Safe and effective. And the kids would come in with ear infections and sinus infections and crying and fevers and miserable. And the nurses would come up to me and say, "Well, they're behind on their vaccine. Should we catch them up?" And I said, "No, don't bother with that. They got enough to deal with right now. Their family doctor can deal with that later." And that was pretty much the extent of my knowledge of vaccines while I was up till 2000. So in 1996, I moved to Cleveland, started an integrative holistic practice there. And a couple years later, there was just moms that would come into the clinic clutching their babies to their chest with wide eye and saying, "What's your position on vaccines?" And I would say, "Well, I don't really have a position. I don't really think they're necessary. I don't, at that point in time, I didn't know anything about the 1986 Act. I didn't know about the big ramp up of the schedule. I didn't know anything. So this was like 1998. And I was like, "Well, I don't think they're really necessary. I wasn't vaccinated and I'm alive to talk about it. I think I'm healthier because of it." And so that was but they planted a seed, like there must be some concern out there about vaccines. And then in summer of 2000, I got a flyer in the mail for the National Vaccine Information Center annual conference. So NVIC is a small nonprofit in Washington, D.C. I picked up the flyer, and it was such an inconvenient time for me to go. And so I even went so far as to call them and say, "When's your next conference? Because I don't think I can make it to this one." They said, "Well, we're a small nonprofit. We don't even know if we'll have another conference." So every time I went to throw, and I distinctly remember it was on gray paper, just a trifold with nothing fancy. Every time I went to throw it in the wastebasket, I just put it back on the counter. Somehow magically, it'll end up back on my counter. And I thought, well, there must be somebody really important I need to meet to go to this meeting, not about something. That's why I'll go. So I decided to go down to this meeting. It was in September of 2000. There were about 700 people there from all over the country, moms of vaccine-injured kids, moms of unvaccinated kids. And I sat for 3.5 days and listened to doctors, scientists, researchers, lawyers, moms, all sorts of things talking about problems associated with vaccines. And I was like, how in the world did I miss this? At this point in time, I'd been a doctor for 15 years. I'd had my own clinic for 4 years. How did I not know anything about this? How did I miss this?
Which is pretty wild, real quick, because you grew up in a chiropractic family that was already not pro-vaccine necessarily. And that just sort of shows how deep the conditioning and also the obfuscation of true information really goes, even at that point in time.
Yeah. And I just thought, where do I start? I went home and my head was just spinning. I mean, I distinctly remember coming home after that conference and sitting on my couch going, "Wow, what do I do with this? Well, I guess I better look into this. Where do I start?" So I thought, well, let me see. If I was a lawyer, I'd probably start with Supreme Court cases. So I guess I'll start with the CDC. They're supposed to be the experts on all this vaccine stuff. So I pulled out the general recommendations of vaccination, which would have been the 1998 version, because this was September of 2000. And at that point in time, about every 2 years, they were writing kind of a new version for this. So I pulled out the 1998 version. I read it. It's like a 42-page paper. And I went, this is it? I mean, this is it. It was poorly written, very dumbed down. All the references were the CDC. So it'd be like Sherri Tenpenny publishing a paper and every reference was written by Sherri Tenpenny, you know? It's like, how credible is this? And then it was just terrible. So I thought, well, I better look a little closer, look at some other things. I guess I'll look at the Pediatric Infectious Disease Journal. Maybe they've got something about vaccines. And that's kind of how you had like a ball of yarn and you started pulling little threads and you just pulled and pulled and pulled. And so that initial investigation, I at that point in time, they had a lot of services. They really don't have them now that you could subscribe to, that because you were a subscriber, you were able to get access to full text articles and things like that. Now, and even at that time, when you went to buy an article, it was maybe $5 or $6. And now they're like $57 up to like $75. And you may buy it and it may not even be what you're looking for. And so these paywalls are just terrible.
Yeah,
back at that point in time, it was a little bit easier if you belonged to these services to be able to get access to them. So at that point in time, from September of 2000, when I started the initial investigation, that grew into 25 years and 50,000 hours worth of investigation. And it used to be such an obsession of mine that I would be in the office from 9 to 6, and I'd come home and I'd fix a little stir fry for dinner, and I'd run upstairs to my upstairs office, and I would be going through as much as I could find about each one of the vaccines till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, 7 days a week.
Wow.
There were times when I took 2 to 3 weeks off from my clinic practice. I found a little place on the beach, little place on the beach in California, in Encinitas, and I'd go out there for 3 weeks and do nothing for 18 hours a day but research and write about this. And I started writing manuals for parents and manuals for doctors. And I was hired by a company called Apex Energetics, that they had just come out with a homeopathic line that had to do with prevention and treatment of things like measles and pertussis and that. And they hired me. And because Armand, who is the president of Apex Energetics, we got to be pretty good friends, and he really believed in my message. And he hired me for about 2.5 years. That every other weekend I was on the road somewhere giving conferences to chiropractors and acupuncturists and nurse practitioners, a very, very few MDs or DOs that might wander into the mix for 2.5 years. And so every other weekend I would be speaking to groups of 20 to 50, just planting all those seeds and then also talking about their product lines and stuff like that. And so that's kind of how I got started in doing this. And I wrote manuals, and there weren't Substacks or anything like that. Then there was back in the day when you wrote blogs. You remember that? Yeah. And so we did that. And I put together 2 really thick, like 3-inch binders of material. I made a lot of DVDs, and that was, DVDs were just getting started after VHS. It tells you how old I am, right? And that we had DVDs and we sent them all out, and we sold them. And that was one of the product lines that we were selling. And one day I got a letter in the mail from some gentleman who was retired from the military, and he was he watched my DVD. It was a 3-hour DVD called The Risk, the Benefits, and the Choices. And it went through all the different vaccines at the time. This would have been 2002 or 3, something like that. So there are a whole lot more vaccines that are developed since then. So I went through this whole thing, and he wrote me a letter, and he said, "Would you mind if I made copies of your DVD and handed them out?" And I said, "Well, I do mind, because we sell them."
Mm-hmm. Right.
And he said, "Well, I found it on Google Videos." So I went out and looked at Google Videos, and it had 57,000 views.
Wow.
I thought, oh, if I'd had $1 for each one of those,
nice. Yeah, like I'm doing this as a vocation here. I'm spending my
because I had to rent out studios and
right.
all those recording things and stuff like that. So that's kind of how more and more and more information started to get out there. And now, 25 years, in September, it'll be 25 years since I've been doing this.
Wow.
And it's my whole life,
Yeah.
Because it started, it's like if I'm not sleeping, I'm generally eating, writing, talking, investigating, researching something about vaccines. And I really have stuck with it because it's what God told me to do. In 2002, I was sitting upstairs in my upstairs office. It was probably 2:00 in the morning. I remember I was sitting, my desk sat this way, and there was a window that looked out across the street. And it was snowing, looked like a little Rockwell moment out there, coming down the street. And I was looking at information from the CDC's pink book about pertussis. And this was like the 6th version. There's now like 20 versions. And you can't even find the 6th version anymore. But it said, because people believe that there's a problem with vaccines and there's no syndromes of vaccines. And I'm paraphrasing. They said when a child has a seizure disorder, myoclonic jerks, or dies of SIDS, parents will blame vaccines, but it was really nothing to do with the vaccine. It had to do with the defective child. And I just sat there, just froze. And I just started sobbing, because I realized that that's truly what they teach physicians. It's not about all the garbage that's being injected into these little human beings. It's about the defective child that can't stand up from the assault of all this poison. And I was just sobbing. And I just said, Lord, why'd you give me this to do? Why didn't you give me Tony Robbins, Go Team Rah Rah? I mean, why did you give me this to do? And I'm just crying and crying. And I heard him say, I heard a voice out loud, and I was the only person in the house, out loud say, because you're willing to do the work. And it's like, I sat there for a second and I kind of looked around and I thought, well, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. So I've never really stopped. And for the first 3 years, I was really angry. I was just, and the first 3 years, I could say, I kept trying to find the paper, the statement, the something of why we did this. Mm-hmm. Why are we injecting all this stuff into kids?
Yeah.
Because we're so afraid of the measles or mumps. I mean, come on. A chicken pox? Really? And so I was really mad. I was mad at the pharmaceutical industry for making the product. I was mad at the doctors for giving the product. I was mad at the parents for allowing it to be injected into their kids and not even questioning, like, what's coming through that needle? Do they really need it? I was really angry. And then I figured, well, this probably isn't, you can get more flies with honey. And this probably isn't going to resonate very well with people. So I started looking at the material, and it was like, my role is really just to disseminate this information. It's not my job to make it sprout. It's not my job to make it grow. It's not my job for anybody to listen to me. So I sort of adopted this position of the parable of the sower in the Bible, that for, your listeners, the parable of the sower is just the sower sows seeds. Some seeds fall on rocky soil and the birds pluck it away. Some fall in soil and start to grow and get choked out by the weeds. Some start to grow and then get scorched out by the sun. But some seed falls on good soil and grows up and bears fruit 30, 60, 100 times. So when you analyze that, that means that sometimes it just, bounces off of people's forehead. That's the rocky soil. And don't waste your time over there. Some, it gets choked out by the pediatricians and the family members who say, what do you mean you're not going to vaccinate your child? Some people really start to get in it. And then when they start to get in, they realize that it's hard. And then so they kind of give up. That's the scorched out by the sun. But 1 in 4, and I tell this story a lot because for people that are constantly saying, I've told everybody I know and they just don't listen to me and they're getting so discouraged, it's only 25% of your seed is going to fall into good soil. And you're not going to do better than the good book. You're not going to do better than God, 25%. The thing is you don't know which seed is going to hit the mark, which is going to be like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. You don't know where the good soil is. And you have no control over how long it takes for that seed to sprout. It's not your job. And so sometimes you may be talking to somebody like here, and the person that's really the good soil is somebody that's eavesdropping over there in the corner, and you don't even see them, you don't even know, and they take it and run with it, and they're the good soil. So our job is really, I've always considered myself Joanna Appleseeds. Like I got this big bucket under my arms, and I'm just throwing seeds. And so where they land, it's kind of the Holy Spirit has to direct that. How long it takes to sprout up and grow. It may not be until 8 years from now when you decide to have a family, or when you just suddenly have grandchildren that are coming into place that you go, I think I heard a lecture about this at one point in time. I should probably go look that up. It's not your job.
Right.
But so for whatever it is that you're talking about, whatever it is that you're talking about, when you're disseminating a message, when you're talking about the gospel, when you're talking about whatever it is that resonates with your heart, don't get discouraged. Just keep sowing seeds, keep throwing them out there, because if you've got a specialized body of knowledge that you spend a lot of time researching and you want to talk to people about or train people about, it's not your job to make the sprout. And that was so important, Alec, for me when I talked about that, like during COVID. Because people were so discouraged, to try to get their friends and family members and their boss and all these other people to say no to this massive poisoning that was going on. I have a lawyer friend of mine who he told me, he said, every single person in my family and extended family, he said, maybe 45 people have gotten 2 shots and at least 1 booster, except for me and my fiance. And he said, I just decided that I tried everything I knew how to do to get him to stop. And they're all sick and they're all dying. And he said, I just treat all of them as if they came up and announced to me that the doctor said I have a terminal disease. He said, so I treat all of them with so much respect, because it may be the last time that I see them. And he said, it's sort of, he said, instead of me being angry at them and mad about the whole situation, he said, it changed my heart to be more compassionate and say, well, you did what you did, and I don't know how long you're going to be here. We know for sure it's shortened your life. So I'm going to love you and be kind to you for as long as I've got you.
I love that. And the position that I've really tried to take, especially over the last 2.5 years, because especially during COVID, I think I came across like pretty aggressive initially, right? But I was also an Army officer in the Army for the first 1.5 years of that whole nonsense. So I felt very defensive in my initial speaking. But I really have come to the position that the best thing to do, even for people who've received the shots, right? Maybe that's what they required in order to wake up, is to be injured. Like, think of all the many people who were injured themselves, and that's what woke them up to what's going on, so that they can be a messenger for other people to warn other people. But I also know countless people, and I'm not going to say this applies to everyone, both who received the COVID shot or who have had a child that was vaccine injured, that were able to recover from that injury because God made our bodies so brilliant, so miraculous. And yes, these products are poisonous, and we'll get into all that during this episode. But the point that I'm getting at is I try to educate people on the brilliance, the innate intelligence, the ability to adapt, the ability to self-regenerate, self-heal of the human body. Because if you educate people on that, while also giving facts related to vaccines, but not doing it from like a fear position, like, hey, you need to be deathly afraid, because we know that fear itself is a great impact, or has a great impact on disease outcomes, the placebo, nocebo effect, psychosomatics, et cetera, et cetera. But if you educate people on the brilliance of the human body, it takes out the need to ever receive one of these products in the first place. Because if you truly understand how miraculous this is the best technology ever created by the Creator. Man can only create in the image of that and will always be inferior to that which was created by God. And because of that, this thing is so miraculous. And if you can get people to truly understand it and embody that, they're need to ever get one of those products goes out the window in the first place. And of course, it's always helpful to have additional information like, okay, what actually happened with the 1986 NVCIA? What happened with, what are aluminum adjuvants actually about? Is there any safety studies on that? Double-blind randomized controlled trials. We're going to get into all that information here, but that's sort of the position that I've taken. And you can see even the people who have been injured, they have now hope that like, oh, wow, my body is incredible. I can heal from this. Now, it's a long road ahead for a lot of those people. Don't get me wrong. But the point is, I think if we can focus on helping people understand that in addition to sharing the information on vaccines, I think it then drops the fear and makes it so, wait, fear is the paradigm that has conditioned me to think I need these things in the first place. Now I don't have any fear because I know how brilliant this thing is. Why would I need to get one of those? I don't need to get any of those. That's ridiculous. And so that's sort of the position that I've taken. I think it's been somewhat effective. And to your other point, this is really cool, full circle. It's actually because of you. So in late 2016, early 2017, I think you had made a post at that time about vaccine ingredients. And I shared it on my Facebook. Just vaccine ingredients, like listed the excipient list and listed either by the CDC or the WHO. I don't remember at the time, but may have been the FDA. But nonetheless, vaccine excipient list. And I just shared it on my Facebook, and this was like my first entry into vaccines. West Point classmate of mine who is going through medical school at the time. Few graduates from West Point are able to go to medical school as part of the Army. Comments on it publicly and basically shaming me for even questioning vaccines. Full circle moment, and I shared this on my Facebook a few months ago. He has now come around, he's a practicing physician, come around to saying, hey, dude, I got to give you credit. Your work that you've done over the past few years, I've been silently watching, this is paraphrasing, but I have now fully understood exactly what you're trying to get at back then, and I have to say you were right. And it's weird for me to say this as a physician, but you were 100% right. So the point of planting seeds, like I had no clue. I had no clue who was going to listen to what I was saying at that time. But coming full circle, here's a physician saying like, oh no, I now see. I see what's going on. I see the truth of this whole vaccine paradigm. And I applaud you and appreciate you for just continuing to plant seeds and just trusting that they will fall on ripe soil where they need to and then proliferate. And then those people will spread seeds. And that's all we can continue to do on this topic.
Yeah. I mean, it's a 200-year myth. It's a 200-year multi-generational indoctrination that vaccines are safe, effective, necessary, and harmless. And every one of those statements I just made are lies. Vaccines are not safe. You know, the definition of effective, we do a whole course on this at learningforyou.org, which is our sister site, which is learning the number 4, YOU.org, on safe and effective. That safe is, not one vaccine has ever been proven to be safe because they don't use true placebos, number one, and they don't follow them long enough to see. All they're looking for is did it make you die? And if you didn't die, they call it safe. They never talk about asthma, allergies, eczema, ADD, ADHD, the long list of neurological problems, the autoimmune diseases that take a long time to develop. None of that is followed because if it's more than 72 hours later that you develop a side effect, it says, well, that didn't have anything to do with the vaccine, which is an arbitrary line that was drawn in the sand in the early 1990s by the FDA. And we assume when we hear safe, effective, that we as consumers assume that that means it keeps you from getting sick. It's effective. But truly, when you look up the definition of effective in Webster's, what it means is that it does what it was intended to do. And so effective, really, what was the vaccine intended to do? When you inject that foreign matter, it is intended to develop an antibody. They call it a protective antibody, which it's not, because you can be fully vaccinated, have very high antibody levels, and contract that illness anyways. And I actually have from probably the early 2000s, I have an ACIP transcript that's, it's like this thick. And at one point in the middle of the transcript, they start talking about antibodies. And one of the ACIP members says to the other one, we don't want to talk about that here because we know that we don't know what the antibodies do, and they don't really keep people from getting sick. So the only thing it was intended to do was to develop an antibody. Then does the antibody protect you? Probably not, because when you really understand what happens in immunology, when there's a real infection that's going on, antibodies are the last thing to show up. You've got cytokines and white blood cells and all these different things that happen first, macrophages and all that, until the infection is under control. Then the B cells come in at the very end to learn what this whole infectious process was about, so that if you get exposed again, it spits out a little bit of real antibody and at the time to neutralize it. And vaccines, by definition, are supposed to develop this antibody so that you can have these protective antibodies and not have to get sick, except they're antibodies against fabricated stuff that's been injected into your body, not even the real thing that's making you sick. So, they're not effective. They're not safe. I mean, they're not, let me rephrase that. They're not safe, effective. They're not necessary. I mean, look at any completely unvaccinated child that you might see. They're running, they're ahead on their milestones. They're bright. They're inquisitive. They're not sick. They're not on daily chronic inhalers and all these. They're not constantly getting sinus infections and ear infections and all those things. And then compare that to a fully vaccinated child that's on multiple medications, ear infections, sinus infections, gut issues, neurological problems. And the unvaccinated kid gets a cold, goes away in a couple of days. Yep. It's no big deal. And then every single vaccine, and it doesn't matter. I mean, you don't have to have a really big reaction. Like, you don't have to have anaphylaxis or develop seizures or have a big neurological complication. But on a cellular level, because of all the stuff that's in there, it's just shaving off a little bit of your health and causing a little bit of, it's like taking just a little bit of sand and throwing in your car engine. It starts to clunk a little bit. It may not completely shut the engine down, but it's just not running right. And that's what all these vaccines do. So they're not safe, they're not effective, they're not necessary, and they definitely cause harm, every single one of them. So when the pro-vaccine people say safe, effective, and necessary, you can say, no, they're not to any of those things.
What if nature's intelligence could directly influence your physiology, helping to regulate your nervous system, sharpen your intuition, and shift your emotional state in a measurable way? For over 25 years, Lotus Way has been pioneering the use of flower essences, liquid infusions that capture the bioenergetic imprint of plants. Unlike essential oils, these remedies work on a vibrational level, interacting with your body's meridians and electrical system to promote clarity, resilience, and balance. Katie Hess, who I featured on episode 74 of the Way Forward podcast, has spent decades studying the effects of over 300 rare and powerful flowers, hand collecting them from across the world. The result? A line of elixirs, mists, and anointing oils, and even some chocolate, designed to shift your state of mind and body, not through placebo, but through the subtle yet profound ways plant frequencies interact with human biology. I think flower essences are severely overlooked in the wellness space because it really is an incredible way to package up the wisdom and the innate intelligence of nature and deliver it to your body. And it brings your body back into coherence because it's tuning you on an energetic level like an instrument. So if you want to find which flower essences are right for you, you can take the flower quiz so you can see which ones match your current energetic state. As a listener of The Way Forward, you get an exclusive discount. Just use code ALEC10 for 10% off your first order. Or if you're the Way Forward member, get 20% off plus ongoing savings, and just reach out to us if you're a member and we'll get you your membership discount. Just go to lotusway.com/Alec or just head to the show notes so you can experience one of nature's most powerful energetic remedies today. For generations, our ancestors lived in harmony with nature, thriving on a nose-to-tail approach to nourishment. Organ meats, often called nature's multivitamin, were a staple, providing essential nutrients that supported energy, brain function, skin, gut health, and reproductive vitality. Yet today, these deeply nourishing foods are largely missing from modern diets, leaving many of us unknowingly depleted. Let's be real though, most of us aren't eating organ meats the way our ancestors did. Whether it's the taste, texture, or simply a shift away from traditional foods, we've lost touch with this vital source of nourishment. And that's where Paleo Valley's grass-fed organ complex comes in. It's an easy way to reconnect with ancestral wisdom and replenish the nutrients we're meant to thrive on. Sourced from grass-fed cows on small regenerative farms in the US, this blend includes liver, heart, and kidney, freeze-dried to preserve their full nutritional integrity. No fillers, no synthetic processing, just pure, bioavailable nourishment. Those who incorporate the grass-fed organ complex notice more energy, balanced moods, and renewed vitality, sometimes within days. If this speaks to you, you can explore more by visiting the show notes or heading to paleovalley.com/thewayforward. And in this case, forward is fully spelled out. So paleovalley.com/theway, FORWARD, and a 15% discount will be automatically applied at checkout. You know what's really interesting too? There's so many threads I want to pull on there, and maybe beneficial to start at the beginning, relatively speaking, the beginning with the 1986 NVCIA and the information there. We know this goes back 200 years. Luckily, I just had on Roman Bystrionic, co-author of Dissolving Illusions with Suzanne Humphreys a few months ago, and that was a fantastic episode. So all things related to mortality and disease incidence and infectious disease fears, we discussed that in episode 164, I believe is the number. I can throw that in the show notes as well. But there is one thread I want to pull on related to what you said. With respect to effective, right? I want to give an example, and a modern example, and this also goes into absolute risk reduction versus relative risk reduction, which is a clever tactic, statistical manipulation, you could say, that is used in order to make the claim that vaccines are a certain percentage of effective. So in the Pfizer clinical trials for the COVID shots, they claimed that the shots were 95% effective, which was based on relative risk reduction, comparing one group to another group without the context of the larger incidence of disease. In this case, the primary efficacy endpoint for the COVID shot was focusing on mild symptom reduction, not infection, transmission, or severe disease. They basically measured efficacy by looking at symptomatic PCR positive illness. That's how they determined whether they were effective or not. But I think it would benefit people to look into the difference between absolute risk reduction and relative risk reduction, because they claim that the shots are 95% effective in the COVID clinical trials for the Pfizer shot. But when you look at the absolute risk reduction, it's only 0.84% effective. And again, effective is defined as symptomatic PCR positive illness. That's what they're measuring against. So the placebo group, 162 people out of 18,000 developed or were symptomatic and PCR positive. In the vaccine group, only 8 out of 18,000. So when you compare 8 to 162, which is what they did, that's how you can claim 95% effective. But you're leaving out the context that there were 36,000 people in total in those clinical trials, which brings it down to only 0.84% effective. And again, effective is defined as symptom reduction. It has nothing to do with anything to do with transmission, severe disease, et cetera, et cetera. So that's some of the manipulation tactics that they use statistically in order to make the claim that something is effective. And then when it goes back to what you're talking about with it being safe, there's no double-blind randomized controlled trial that I know following long-term adverse events related to vaccines using inert placebos or following the entire childhood vaccine schedule. And please correct me if I'm wrong on that, because not that I know of.
There's no placebo-controlled trials. It was interesting because just recently, when Secretary Kennedy has made that statement, there's 2 points I want to make about that. And one is in the most recent roasting by the senators that they did over the HHS budget, which they never did get around talking about the budget. All that it was there for was showmanship and to try to see if they could do a gotcha to Kennedy, right? So it was maybe halfway through, because of that committee, Senator Cassidy is the head of the committee, and he said, before we move on to the next person, I want to make a comment that I want to, for the record, that what he said was incorrect. That there are placebo-controlled trials for rotavirus, measles, and Gardasil. And so he's wrong about that they are control. So I did a Substack on that. So I had my team pull out that little clip and put it onto my Substack, and I did the research onto rotavirus vaccines, Gardasil, and measles. Well, measles was back before they did a lot of postings. There's no definition of whether they ever did even clinical trials on measles. So we can assume that there was no placebo because they really didn't even test it. They just started giving it to people. The Gardasil vaccine is well known that in the clinical trials, they used a shot of aluminum as the placebo because Gardasil has aluminum in it. So they compared the side effects to a shot of aluminum, and they called that a placebo, which it wasn't.
Right.
Because by definition, a placebo is something that's truly inert and non-reactive in the human body.
Saline or something like this.
Then I looked up the rotavirus vaccine. It took me over 6 hours of research to find, because a lot of times they'll say as compared to placebo, but they never state what the placebo is. And so I had used, and I wrote this in my Substack, that I'd use clinicaltrials.gov, I'd use the CDC, I'd use Google, I used Grok, and I used ChatGPT. And I finally found it in some obscure document that was the original submission in a footnote in size 2 font underneath there on the Rotarix virus. There was an asterisk of what the placebo was. And it was that they used Rotarix that they were trying to bring to market. And then the placebo was the Rotarix virus, or the Rotarix vaccine minus the virus. So they were comparing the Rotarix to the Rotarix. And so the same number of injuries came out. So it was as safe as placebo. And the only other, so the Rotatech virus, you couldn't find it anywhere except it said in one article that I found from the New England Journal of Medicine, it said it used the Rotatech vaccine as a comparator. And so the assumption is it's the same. And so I said, I kind of gave Cassidy a little bit of a buy. I said, well, unless you're willing to do 6 hours of research to find out what the placebo was in this particular trial, when you read the New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA or whatever you're reading, and it says as compared to placebo, your assumption as a physician, your assumption is they used sterile water, which they don't ever.
Because they say the word placebo, so that conjures up for most people, an inert substance.
Just like when they say the word effective.
Right.
It means it's supposed to keep you from getting sick.
Right.
And so if you go down through all of those vaccines, it's the same thing. That they and then in 2013, there was a big shift that happened, that the World Health Organization came out with a paper about placebo-controlled trials. And this has been burbling for maybe 10 years. But in 2013, they came out with a position paper that when you've got two sets of people, one that you're trialing a new product on, and the other set is supposed to get a placebo, that's very disadvantageous to those people because they're in a clinical trial and getting no benefit and no protection. And so you're using their time and their bodies and all this other stuff to compare, and they should get a benefit from that. So they changed the definition on the word placebo. And so they, just like how they changed the definition on vaccine with the COVID jabs that we know are, bioweapons, they're not vaccines. They changed the definition. So now, if there is a vaccine that has already been safe and effective and approved by the FDA or the EMA, I believe is the organization in Europe that approves vaccines. If there's already been a vaccine that has been approved and is said to be safe and effective, you're required to use that vaccine in a clinical trial as the placebo. So if you're for your audience, I'll give an example. Let's say that there are about 5 approved hepatitis B vaccines on the market. And let's say you are wanting to bring forth a new hepatitis B vaccine. So you're going to use the new hepatitis B vaccine over here. And then to the people in the control group, you will use a hepatitis B vaccine that has already been proven to be safe and effective. Now, instead of calling it a placebo, they call it a comparator.
Oh, wow.
So you're comparing the new vaccine to the side effect profile of a vaccine that's already been proven to be safe and effective. And if they are the same, then we can bring this new one to trial because it's the same as this one.
But there's a huge problem with that. There's many problems with that. One of which is like you're still not comparing that to an inert substance on itself.
Absolutely.
But then there's also the assumption that I think is baked in for a lot of credentialed experts who may come across this information. And that assumption is probably, oh, well, if you regress and go back and compare that one to that one, and then go back a few years and see what that one was compared to, I bet it ultimately lands that the initial one was compared to an inert placebo. But that's just not true.
And a lot of times before they made this big change, they still used another vaccine for the comparator, and they would use something like meningitis C vaccine, which they say is inert. Excuse me? Right. Maybe the meningitis C particle off of the side of the meningitis C of the bacteria may be inert, but what about all the chemicals that are in that vaccine? Right. All those different things. And many of the times starting in about 2002, they started coming out with combination vaccines because, parents were kind of going, wait a minute, if the nurse came in and they had like 6 or 7 vials of drawn up for shots, it's like, why are you giving my baby 6 shots? And it's like, no, thank you. I don't want to do that. So they started to decide, well, what happens if we all mix those all together in just one shot? And one of the first ones that came to market was Pediarix. And what they did when they trialed that was they had a shot that had all 5 of the vaccines in it in one shot, and they compared it to the 5 shots given individually. And if the ones with the 5 shots given individually, if you developed as high of an antibody level as just if you gave them all together in one syringe, they were compared to be safe and effective and equal to placebo.
Wow.
And they've done that with almost all of the vaccines that are the combination vaccines. One of the comparator steps is all of this junk, 5, 6, 7. There's a 7 antigen vaccine in one of them. And you give that and you compare it to the 7 of things given like hepatitis B, TBT, individual is given individually.
Yeah.
That's how they say, oh, it's as safe as giving them individually. So this is a good product. And then when the nurse comes in with just one syringe, then parents are deceived. And when the nurse says, you're only getting 1 shot today, but inside of that shot is 7 vaccines.
What's so wild about that is, again, the claim that they make that we're comparing this to another vaccine because that other vaccine was already proven to be safe and effective. Where is the evidence for that claim that vaccine, and again, if you regress to the previous vaccine, to the previous one, because they're all compared against other vaccines, or oftentimes, again, like you said, that they pull the quote virus out, but again, there's still aluminum, like aluminum hydroxide, aluminum phosphate, polysorbate 80, foreign genetic material, all these other chemicals.
Cow blood, chicken parts, parts of particles of eggs.
Monkey cell culture.
Dog kidney cells.
Yes, exactly.
All those different
random
things.
Foreign genetic material of all types. And the whole point is they're making this claim that, we're comparing it to something that was already proven to be safe and effective when they first did not validate that claim that it was proven to be safe and effective in the first place.
Yeah. And, and that was in 2013. And a lot of people don't know about that paper that I found. It was, and even when you read it, it's technically challenging to figure out what they're trying to say. And, but since 2013, they've come out with more vaccine or more papers that kind of explain it in better language so you can really understand what they're saying. But researchers are now compelled by this new standard to use another vaccine. And that's why if you read more recent package inserts, it doesn't use the word placebo. It uses the word comparator.
That's wild.
And I think that it's because people like you and me and our audiences and stuff like that, people are tuned in to the idea about what was the placebo.
Yeah.
And so they twisted that so that they could deceive people even at another level.
Yeah, totally. I want to go back, if we can, to the 1986 NVCIA, because I think that was a very important point in history in which the vaccine schedule just took off astronomically just after that. So could you just share all that you've come across and come to understand as it pertains to the 1986 NVCIA?
Well, I'm not nearly as conversant about that as, say, Barbara Fisher is, the founder of the National Vaccine Information
Don't
Center.
sell yourself short, though. You know a lot.
Because, I mean, she was there every
Yeah.
step of the way, and I've heard her speak about this a lot, and she gets really disquieted by it, because she said what they promised us at the beginning, would be what happened historically is that so many of the pharmaceutical industry manufacturers that were making vaccines, particularly the pertussis vaccine, were getting sued because of all the brain injury that the whole cell pertussis vaccine was causing. And so they went to Reagan and they said, vaccination is the cornerstone of our public health policy. And because we're losing our shirts on these vaccines, we're just going to quit. We're not going to make them anymore. And of course, the senators who've been bought off by the pharmaceutical industry for decades said, we can't have that happen. And so they got together and they decided they would pass a protective act for the pharmaceutical industry, the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, Childhood Injury Compensation Act, so that if a child took one of their vaccines, and at the time, remember, there was only 3 vaccines. At the time that they passed this law, there was only DPT, MMR, and polio. So if they took a DPT and they end up with a vaccine injury, a brain injury, or any other kind of injury, then they could apply for compensation. It'd be like you're taking one for the team. So the government is going to pay compensation to pay for your injury and to pay for your medical bills and perhaps loss of livelihood or participation in society and all that stuff. And it was meant to be a no-fault, non-antagonistic claim. You say, here's my medical bills. My doctor said, yes, this is caused by the DPT. You send basically the invoice to the government and they go, okay, and they write you a check. Well, very shortly after that, it began to change. And instead of being a no conflict, no application process, it ended up going through the Federal Court of Claims and being adjudicated by these judges they call special masters. And the legislation only said we can only have 9 special masters, which will apply for, to say that even now there's still only 9 special masters, even though we went from 3 vaccines to 16 or 17 vaccines, and the number of injuries that need to run through that court system, they're backlogged by more than 3 years because there's not enough judges. And we've tried to change it, and that's another whole conversation. But it became very antagonistic, and some very young Department of Justice lawyers who wanted to make a name for themselves started working in the Federal Court of Claims against the parents, to where it became very antagonistic. And you weren't supposed to have to prove, like, beyond a shadow of a doubt and all this other things, like as if you murdered somebody.
Right.
And so it became very antagonistic, very clogged up inside of the system. And there was a lot of things that were papers that were built and all this other stuff that they ended up taking 3,500 autism claims and throwing them out and saying we're not compensating autism at all. There's nothing here to say that the vaccines caused any injury. And so there's a lot of pieces and parts that each step along the way it got worse. There was the Wyeth case that came out that the lawyers for the parents said, well, if we can't sue because of a vaccine injury, maybe we can sue because of the way of a faulty manufacturing process, and we can sue about the aluminum, all the aluminum and the mercury that's in the vaccines. Well, then the judge came out and said, no, you can't sue over a faulty product because the pharmaceutical industry is protected on their manufacturing skills too.
Wow.
So from every single step, when you are required to take your baby in, or you think you're required to take your baby in, to be injected with all of these poisons, and something adverse happens, there's really nobody you can sue. You can't sue the pharmaceutical industry. You can't sue the government. You can't sue the doctor. You can't sue the nurse. You can't sue anybody along the way. You can't sue anybody along the way. And then you are left holding the bag with this vaccine injured child that you've got to come up with ways to treat them. Most of the time your doctors say it wasn't the vaccines and all that stuff, that, there was the defective child thing that we talked about previously. And so it's just, the people just are horribly scammed by this. In fact, Alec, maybe about 6 months ago, I decided I was not going to talk about the pediatric vaccine schedule anymore. I was going to call it the pediatric poisoning schedule.
That's what it is.
Because that's what it is.
Yeah.
And we're going to call it what it is, and that you're required, or you think you're required, but some states have more requirements than the others, to be able to get, your baby's exposed to 4 vaccines while you're pregnant. They require a flu shot, a DPT, a coronavirus vaccine, and the new RSV vaccines that come. And if you're Rh negative, you get a RhoGAM shot.
Insane.
So your baby's exposed to all of this in utero, and the uterus the placenta is not like a steel thing that protects them from all of the stuff that's in the mother's body. In fact, I believe it was around 2006. I'm not sure about that date, but I think it was about that long ago, that the Environmental Working Group did a study on cord blood. So right after the baby's born, as the baby's, when they clamp the cord and they take a little bit of the blood that's coming out of the baby, they take a couple of, couple of cc's and analyze it. And they found over 200 chemicals that had been circulating in that fetus while and the chemicals came from perfumes and cosmetics and lotions and environmental things and stuff you were eating all the time. So that study was meant to show that whatever the mom's exposed to, they expose the baby in utero to. So those babies are exposed to those 4 or 5 vaccines before they're born. Then as hours after they're born, they get antibiotics in their eyes, goopy stuff in their eyes that they can't make eye contact with their mother and their father. They get injected with a synthetic vitamin K shot. They get injected with a hepatitis B vaccine that has 100 micrograms of aluminum in it. And then they get there's 5 different brands of vitamin K on the market. 3 of the 5 also have 100 micrograms of aluminum in them.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So some babies get 200 micrograms of aluminum slammed into them when they're hours old. And now they're supposed to get a new RSV vaccine for newborns.
Wow. Unreal.
And so before this baby is barely old enough to suckle from the breast, they've been exposed to 7 shots. And it's not.
Then you have Pitocin, epidurals, and all the other things on top of that as well, and a typical
the potentials
hospital birth.
of where that could be.
Yeah.
And so it's amazing to me that children make it at all. They live at all because now they get 28 vaccines, 28 injections of vaccine by the time they're 1 year of age.
That's insane. Insane to think about.
By the time they're 1 year of age, and then it's an additional 4 if you include the shots given to the mother. It's amazing to me that any children survive.
Well, unfortunately, this is a perfect example of the resilience of the human body, but we don't have to do any of this stuff. And again, just going back to what you said, moms and dads think that they are required to get these products, and they're not. And yes, because of SB 276, 277 in California and some other states, it becomes increasingly hard. But my response to that is homeschool your kids. And if you're a single mom who's working 4 jobs, okay, it can be a little bit more difficult. Gather together with some other mothers, use our platform that allows you to find like-minded people near you that we've just launched. Get together, form a homeschool pod, pull one of the teachers out of the system because teachers are trying to leave the system at this point, and homeschool your kids at that level. And when it comes to this specific thing, and there are a variety of other things we could talk about as well, but vaccines in particular, this is something that you don't compromise your integrity or your child's health on, in my opinion. There is no, I have to get them vaccinated to put them in school. No, there is none of that. That's.
And if you're one of the 14 states that still have a philosophical exemption, I'm from Ohio, and we're one of them. And you don't need a doctor's excuse. You need a doctor to write you a letter. All you need to do is to say, I'm exercising my right to refuse. Now, different school systems have different rules. Some schools want you to do that every year. Some schools, it's like K through K through 6, and then middle school, and then high school. Some schools want both parents to sign it. Some schools want it notarized. But the bottom line is you have a right to refuse.
Amen.
And what they're all setting up is all policy. But the policy on how you submit that record is still substantiated by the state law. And there's 14 states that have that. And I recently, I heard, I hope this is true, that President Trump is going to look at the 5 states that have removed the religious exemptions and reinstated that people have a right to refuse vaccines that have aborted fetal tissue in them, that have cow blood in them, and they have, all the disgusting things that we can talk about in them. And they have a right from a from a religious perspective to say, my child's body was born fully intact. God did not forget the immune system, which is another thing I should probably mention, because this comes up a lot, because parents are told that they have to vaccinate because their child was born without an immune system. And what the child was born without, so to speak, is the adaptive immune system. We were all born with the innate immune system, our God-given protection from our toll-like receptors. I give this whole talk on toll-like receptors, it's TOLL-LIKE, toll-like receptors. There have been 10 that have been identified in the human bodies. There's more than that with other animals and stuff, but there's 10 that have been identified in the human body. 8 of them we know actually what they do. And I look at them, when I first started reading about them, it made me cry. I thought they were so beautiful. It was like God inside of us, that I think about them as being like little sonar detectors, 24/7, 365, that they're just scanning our blood and making sure stuff that's not supposed to be in there isn't in there. And if they find a bacteria or a flagella off of a certain bacteria or something like that, they like whistle. And they call over a little, cytokines, and they squirt out little cytokines, and the white blood cells come over and gobble it up. This is happening inside of our bodies 24/7. And we're always getting bacteria in our blood from our food, from when we have sex, when we have a bowel movement, when women have their periods every month, or when you cut your finger. There's always things getting in our body. So these toll-like receptors are just taking care of it. They're just fixing it. And they were born with that. The adaptive immune system is when the baby comes home and they get exposed to the dog or the cat or whatever, and then your body goes, yeah, that's okay. I'm not going to, it's okay. I understand, that's okay. That's adapting to the foods that they eat, like even from breast milk or from, formula, God forbid, but all these different things that they adapt to that. And our adaptive immune system separates self from non-self. And then it looks at the non-self stuff and said, is that injurious to us, or is that okay? And we can learn to tolerate that and develop our tolerances to that. That's what happens with your baby comes home. Now, when they get jabbed with all of these poisons and all of this junk that's being injected into their body, it's like taking a handful of salt or sugar and throwing it in your gas tank. It's like, whoa, what's happening here? And you're forcing that adaptive immune system to adapt to stuff that that baby may never be exposed to ever. Like, for example, we still give children 4 to 5 polio vaccines, even though polio has not been present in the Western Hemisphere since 1991 and declared completely polio-free since 1994. That's 30 years ago. There's no polio here. Why are we still vaccinating people for polio and injecting the formaldehyde and all these other things that come with it? And so we are forcing the body to do stuff prematurely in a I don't know how many people have actually picked up a baby that's like 3 days old recently.
I have. My wife, we have a 10-week-old baby at home. So,
well, there you go.
Home birth outside the hospital.
So that they're really fragile.
Yeah.
And they just, wiggle a little bit, and they, eat and poop and sleep. That's like all they do, because they come out of a woman's body at 9 months, but they're not mature. It's just time for them to come out, because they can't get much bigger inside of that belly. And so, but they've got 18 years to mature. And what are we doing to them before 1 year of age? We're injecting poisons into them at birth, at 2 months. Pick up a 2-month-old baby. They're not much different than a newborn baby. 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, in a year that we inject 28 doses of poison into children before they are old enough to sit in their high chair and eat their food-laden Cheerios.
Right.
And so that's kind of, when Secretary Kennedy made this big push about, we're getting all the food dyes and the colorings and all these oil-based or petroleum-based things out of our food. That's a good thing because it shouldn't have been there in the first place. True. And that's a good thing. But, and I sent him a text message, and I've said this on every podcast I've been on, including my own. It's not going, if we suddenly took the entire human race, the entire American population and dropped them into the Garden of Eden, and we had pristine food, pure water, pure air, pure soil, just what God created to make for us. And there was not a single chemical, single anything anywhere. We'd have the best food, most pure food ever. It's not going to matter a squat if we don't stop poisoning children. Mm-hmm. By like I say, by the time they're 1 year of age and they're old enough to sit in their high chair and eat all the artificial food, stuff that they're given, they've already been poisoned 28 times by 1 year of age.
I did did some addition with how many micrograms of aluminum are in each of the shots that kids receive by 1 year of age. And I don't remember off the top of my head, and I'll put this in the show notes if I go back and figure out that this figure is incorrect. But if my memory serves me correctly, it's 13,600 micrograms of aluminum that children receive by 12 months of age.
That's not correct.
It's less?
No, it's less because if they get just under 12,000 micrograms, if they get every dose of every shot by the time they're 18
Okay,
years
so
of
maybe
age.
It was by the time they're 18.
By the time they're 18 years of age, you're correct. You're close. You're correct on that.
Yeah.
But not by 1 year. And I don't know that number off the top of my head. I made some tables of stuff that have that in. They're still getting mercury too. The multi-dose flu shots still have mercury in them. Even though they were supposed to take mercury out of the vaccines in 2004, honestly, they took about most of them, but they didn't issue a product recall and call all those mercury-laden vaccines off the shelf. They went away by attrition. As we used them, we didn't make any more until we got to flu shots. Now they make about 76,000 doses of flu vaccine each season. And out of that, there's about 6,000 doses they make that are mercury-free. So you can request it, and maybe your doctor might have to special order it if you think flu shots work, which is another thing I did with the CDC data. They did this a few years ago. So this is a little bit old data. I did this maybe in 2019. But what I did, every year, there are 120, I believe, CDC testing sites across the country. So if you get what you think is the flu, cough and mucus and all this other stuff, they do a nasal swab. You go to one of these centers, they do a nasal swab, stick it in the tube, and they send it to CDC. Well, as that tube comes in the door, the first thing they do is they test it to see, is it an influenza virus or is it something else? And then if it's an influenza virus, that's when they subtype it and do all the stuff on the news and say it's a match, it's not a match, and all this other stuff. Well, when that first division of whether it's an influenza virus that's making people sick or some other pathogen, a bacteria, anything else that would be making them sick, only 14% of those specimens, and there's over 600,000 they test every year, only 14% are influenza. 86% of the reason that you're getting sick is something else. It may be a bacteria, maybe a protozoa, it may be EMFs, it may be 5G, it may be some other chemicals. So if you're going to believe that flu shots do something of beneficial for you that are going to keep you from getting the flu, it's only going to help in 14% of the time. And I analyzed 20 years of data to come up with that number. And it's the same across the board. It's about 14 to 15% every year. And then they say either it matches by all the viruses that they put in the flu shots. Did we pick the right ones? Is that what's out there in the circulation or not? It's the biggest scam ever. It's just awful. And that we have to start giving babies at 6 months of age their first flu shot. And if you haven't had a flu, if you're by like maybe starting school and you haven't had a flu shot, you get two. You get one, and then 2 weeks later you get another, or a month later you get another one. You get 2 flu shots, and then you get annual flu shots after that. And the multi-dose flu shots still have mercury in them. And if they didn't shake up the vial really well, and you're getting the bottom dose, which is at the bottom, you're getting a higher concentration of mercury than if they shook it up really well and you took the one off the top.
Wow.
So it's poison, 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 poison is what they're introducing into these kids. And the pediatricians will bully parents and kick them out of the practice and call CPS on them and tell them they're just bad parents because they don't want to consistently on the schedule poison their children. We made up some cool little memes that we've sent out all over the place about the pediatric poisoning schedule. And I really would like people who are listening to this to start using that language, because if we could get that to stick, the pediatric, poisoning schedule, and taking my kids in to get them poisoned this week, right, then maybe it would cause a even larger subset of the population to pause. Yeah. And maybe do something unique, like read a package insert. And we teach a course on how to read a package insert. It's probably one of our best sellers. Because if you're not medically based, when you pull out that package insert and unroll it and it goes clear across your dining room table, it can be very intimidating. And you don't know the words, you don't know the language, you don't know how to interpret these things. But there's about 4 or 5 sections in a package insert that are important, and the rest of it is just stuff. And they're always set up the same way by the FDA. Back in the early 90s, they standardized package inserts. So the package insert is the same whether it's a vaccine or a drug, of all the different sections of where they are. So we teach people how to read a package insert, and just, a little off the cuff, if you don't go and get our course and take it, it's section number 11 is the section where the ingredients are in it. And, and sometimes you have to read through it because it doesn't necessarily just list the ingredients. But section number 11 is standardly where you find the ingredients. And that's true whether you're looking up a blood pressure medication or a vaccine. And believe it or not, the FDA makes these little pieces of paper for the doctors and the nurses. Because at the very end, it will say things like, patient education. And these are the things you're supposed to tell the patient, about this particular product, which doctors never do. No. I mean, informed consent never really happens. No. And so they're not designed for the general public, even though we think they're for the general public to get educated. They're supposed to be for doctors and nurses to get educated, which they never read them. They never look at them at all, ever. I want to talk about specific vaccine ingredients and specifically aluminum. But before I do that, I want to bring up something pertaining to vaccine ingredients specifically, because even what's listed on that section 11, in many cases, if this case that I'm about to read is indicative of what actually occurs, is actually an assumption. Like what's actually in them, what's on that list is an assumption. You're assuming that what they're telling you is correct. And here's what I'm talking about. So in Italy in roughly 2017, you may have heard of this, the Gotti and Montanari case where they did mass spectrometry to look at individual constituents and the percentages of them inside of... And what else was in there.
Yes, exactly. Trying to figure out what is actually in these vaccines based on what they claim. So here's the little story. Dr. Antonietta, I mispronounced that, an Italian name, and Dr. Stefano Montanari, they're a pharmacologist, and the other one is a biomedical researcher, were 2 independent scientists in Italy who spent years studying nanoparticle contamination in biological and medical products using advanced electron microscopy and mass spectrometry. So now, I know my audience has heard me scrutinize electron microscopy quite a bit, but when it comes to what is typically non-biological material, electron microscopy can be more efficacious. But nonetheless, they also used mass spectrometry, which is much more, I guess you could say, much better at picking up specificity of the excipients inside of a product. So in 2016 through 2017, they published findings showing that multiple vaccines contain unexpected, undeclared metallic nanoparticles, including stainless steel, tungsten, aluminum salts in crystalline forms other than aluminum hydroxide and aluminum phosphate, which are in many vaccines as adjuvants, which we'll get to, lead, zirconium, antimony, other industrial materials not listed on any ingredient disclosure. goes on to explain that these are toxic to the body, especially when injected. And there's a huge difference between ingestion and injection. We'll get to that in a little bit. But what's more important is after they published these findings, which are shocking in and of themselves, in early 2018, after publicizing some of their work, Gotti and Montanari's laboratory is raided by Italian authorities. Computers, hard drives, and research data was confiscated. No criminal charges were filed, but the clear effect was intimidation and disruption of their ongoing independent research. This act sent a chilling message to independent scientists challenging vaccine purity, even with solid scientific methodology as they were using, because they were using solid scientific methodology. Montanari has openly stated that the raid was politically motivated to halt their research.
Well, the thing that you didn't say about that, which just adds to it, is that these were researchers who were looking, they had been contracted, big government contracts, to looking at the purity of many other products. They weren't just looking at vaccines. They were looking at like oil samples and, for products that they were making for heavy industry and the pure. So they did these standards. They had big government contracts all across Europe to look for purifications, to make sure that there were, it's sort of like when you're making a supplement in your supplement company and you get in raw materials and it gets tested ahead of time to make sure it's not contaminated with cocaine or whatever.
Right.
Well, it's the same thing. That's what they did, is they tested these raw materials. They had big contracts all over the country, all over Europe. And so that wasn't their thing to look at these.
They weren't like trying to like prove that vaccines were corrupted or anything.
Yeah,
like this,
that wasn't
right?
their thing.
Yeah.
But then, for whatever reason, they decided to do it. And the other thing that they did was they looked at a cat vaccine, which was pure. There was nothing else in there but the cat vaccine.
Wow.
And it was just like feline, I don't remember, it's been too long, but feline some cat vaccine that they did. And then all that was in there was that.
Yeah.
So they used that as their placebo, as their standard of comparison, and there was nothing in there except what was supposed to be in there.
Yeah, what they claimed.
And then they found these in these other, there wasn't a huge sample, like maybe 8 or 9 different vials that they looked at, that they found these incredible contaminants, and then they drew out the chemical configuration of what they were, and there was titanium was another thing that was in there, and they were going, "What the heck is this about? We weren't expecting to find this.
Right.
We just thought we were going to find what's on the pack, like the cat vaccine,
Yeah.
And then not only did their lab get raided and their equipment's stolen, their hard drives stolen, they were run out of the country.
Wow.
And so, they came to the U.S. They were here for a while. I don't know since that time what they've done, but they were run out of the country. Their entire business and all this other standardization and all these contracts and stuff they didn't really matter. The same thing happened to Dr. Chris Exley.
Yes.
Chris Exley was, you're talking about aluminum.
Yeah.
I know Chris, and I've had lots of conversations with him, heard him speak when I was in Europe one time. And, he defines himself as Mr. Aluminum. Ever since he was in high school, he had a fascination with aluminum, but aluminum from all sorts of things, from the ground, from the soil, from the air, from water samples, from, looking at aluminum for purity, for tensile strength, and all sorts of things. Published lots of papers for industry, and he's been like the aluminum guy until he received, I believe it was 8 heads of autistic brains of autistic people who had died, and he did the autopsies on these 8 brains. I believe it was 8. I may not be right about that number, and found massive amounts of aluminum in their brains, and the tangled up neural fibrils for Alzheimer's and dementia and all these sorts of things. And as soon as he published that, his lab was raided. He was shut down. He was banned from the university for which he'd worked for years and done all of his research. Everything was shut down. I mean, that goes all the way back to the polio trials with Dr. Betty Eddy. Dr. Betty Eddy was a researcher who, as they were coming out with the polio vaccine, she found the serum that they made these vaccines from. She took the serum and injected them into hamsters. I believe it was hamsters. They grew tumors. And she was like, whoa, wait a minute. Took them to her. She was a big researcher at the NIH, I believe it was. And she had a big lab. She had a bunch of people working for her. She went to her boss and said, we need to hold on this because something's not right here. And this, before we release this to all of these children across this entire country, we just need to look at it. Maybe they just need to clean it up a little bit. She wasn't anti-vaccine, but what she found was like devastating. And she was really concerned about what was going to happen. I mean, she said, there's something in here that's causing these tumors. We need to do a little bit more investigation before we release it. She was fired, shut down her lab. Her boss, ignored it, and the rest is history. And we do know that it contained, SV40 samples that came out of the monkey kidney cells that the polio vaccine was made from. And, 40 million people were injected with a slow virus that caused osteosarcomas and brain tumors and slow growing things. And so the shutdown by the pharmaceutical industry to protect the vaccine has gone back as, at least until the 1940s when they developed in the early 1950s when they developed the polio vaccine. It's been going on ever since.
And how many examples exist that we just haven't heard of either, where other people have discovered something, tried to speak up, were fired, or in some cases, worst case scenario, people have been offed. There's been a lot of stories of that happening. Some of my dear friends, their respective mentors were helping reverse a variety of issues over the course of, the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s, and were suddenly killed or suicided, you could say, for doing the work that they were doing to help people or expose various aspects of these industries.
I've said for a really long time, Alec, that the vaccine industry, that's not correct. The pharmaceutical industry, that the sector of, if you look into like a pie diagram, you've got a sector that's oncology and for all the different types of drugs. And then there's the vaccine sector, which is the smallest. It's the smallest little piece of the pie diagram of all the rest of the stuff. But it is the most valuable because it's, if you can make a customer for life beginning at birth, which really started to really ramp up in 2010 when the Gates Foundation declared 2010 to 2020 the decade of vaccines, that they really pushed it with the elimination of the exemptions and all that stuff that started happening in 2010. Well, that sector, when I first started doing all this research, it was about an $8 billion a year sector. And now it's about $57 billion. And because there's so many more vaccines and globally and all this other stuff. But it's the most important thing. And they will do everything and anything, including offing people, I believe, to protect that and keep that in place. That's why when Secretary Kennedy's doing what he can to try to not step on landmines, keep his job, and move this forward as best as he can, but kind of slowly, because he's got to get buy-in from all of the people that are out there that still believe safe and effective, right? And so he's making that happen because it is the economic loss leader of the entire medical industry. I mean, it's sort of like, I use this analogy a lot, and I talk about it in the book. I use this analogy in my book on zero accountability, is if you're at the mall and you're walking around the mall and there's a big sign in the window, it says, free t-shirt, $50 value, free silkscreen t-shirt. All you have to do is walk in the store. Just by walking in the store, you can get a free t-shirt. So you walk in, you get your free t-shirt. Well, now they've got you captured, and while you're in there, they're going to try to sell you a $1,200 Armani suit and shoes to match and all the accessories and all that stuff. That's why they can give away the vaccines for free, because once they have you in the store, they will sell you forever on their drugs.
Yeah.
I have a really good friend who writes a Substack, and she had this picture in her Substack was last fall that it was burned in my brain. I will never forget it. There was a young man in the picture that was he looked like he might have been 12, severely vaccine injured, when he was a baby, and he was sitting in front of a table, and it must have had 100 bottles of pharmaceuticals of prescription empty and prescription bottles all across the front of him. And the caption said, "These are the pills I took this year." So you've got one child that's on multiple daily medications of that over the course of the 12 months had taken all of these pills. Now multiply that times, there are about 4 million children that are born per year in the United States. And most of them are on something.
Yeah.
And so now so they can give away, that's why they have free vaccine campaigns, and they will come into your job and give you your free flu shot. I can't tell you how many people over the years have said to me, "Well," I said, "You got a flu shot?" And they're like patients of mine. And they say, "You got why?" He said, "Well, it was free."
Oh my goodness.
And I said, "So if they were giving out little free shots of arsenic, would you have taken that too?"
Right.
But
right.
They will do everything to protect that. That's why when Secretary Kennedy was hammered so hard by Senator Cassidy and Pocahontas about, are you anti-vaccine or not? And Bernie was on the high horse about, all these different things, was because they were paid to put in those positions. And there's about 6 different people that are from the House of Representatives. They're all paid heavily by the pharmaceutical industry to protect that vaccine paradigm.
Yeah.
So Kennedy's sweeping firing of all 17 ACEP members, it broke the entire system. It was revolutionary. And people that are not inside of our industry and don't know all the workings don't understand the magnitude. And now they've got all of these people trying to get him impeached, and the Democrats want to get him impeached because he's doing away with science, and that the American Medical Association is going to do this big investigation, even though the AMA has no teeth, no power, and less than 15% of doctors in America are members. But he broke the system, the rubber stamping of every vaccine that ever went through there for the last 60 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's, because a lot of people in the health freedom movement and positions, that have lived this life like I have for the last 25 years. I mean, you just want him to, want it to be like the movie Braveheart.
Mm-hmm.
You just want, Wallace to go in there with a hatchet and chop it all down and blow it all up and send it away. You're fighting the biggest, most moneyed, most evil, most powerful organizations on the planet. Mm. And it can't for us, it can't happen fast enough. Like the PrEP Act should have been signed away on day one. Stopping mRNA and saRNA vaccines should have been done day one. It can't happen that way. And I know a lot of people in our movement are just sick and tired of hearing that. They're sick and tired of, give it a little time. It's like, well, I think he's been in office 112 days. I mean, probably the first 30 days it takes to learn the job and learn who the players are and who's foe and who's trying to sabotage everything that you say and slow walk all this other stuff.
My thing real quick is, though, that there is an ideological shift that I think people would benefit from adopting, that irrespective of what happens in government, stop outsourcing your power to them and stop allowing them to dictate your decisions anyway.
100% correct.
It doesn't matter what happens there.
100%.
Right? That's a position that I take, and I educate my audience on that. Yes, if they do some things that may dismantle some of the corruption in there, that's great. Of course, I'm going to celebrate that. But irrespective of whether that occurs or not, I'm going to be educating my people on understanding that the only true authority is God. They need to stop outsourcing their authority to men and women in government and start making decisions irrespective of what they try to tell you should do.
I 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
But we have to think about what's standing behind us, like what they just did in Singapore. Mm. They just passed laws in Singapore that if the government requires you to get a vaccine, not only do you have to get it, if you question it or resist it, it is 6 months in jail and $10,000 fine. Mm. And if you resist it a second time, I think that it's a $20,000 fine and 3 years in jail or something like that. Yeah. And if people who are listening to this may look that up. I may be a little bit off on the numbers.
The general idea. Yeah.
The general idea.
Yeah.
And so that is a reality.
True.
It really is a reality of what's back there. So we need to support the positive movement. And there's a friend of mine who writes a big Substack. He's really, really involved. And one of the things he recently said was, I've been following and been involved in all these government things for the last 40 years. And I can honestly say in the last 40 years, it's only gotten worse. There's not been one single step positive forward on anything. But now we see a little bit of a positive step. I mean, when Bobby went in and said, no, to the pregnant women and to healthy children, our movement was like, what do you mean you need to get rid of all of them? And they crucified him. And it's like, wait a minute. The only vaccine that has been pulled off the schedule ever was the Rotoshield vaccine in 1999. It's been 26 years since anything has happened inside of that industry. Yes, we want more. Yes, we need more. Yes, I think we need to take Macari to task more than Kennedy to task. And yes, we need to keep the pressure on, but can't we do it respectfully? Do you have to mudsling and name call and all those different things? Can't we be grateful that there is a positive movement? I mean, when has anybody at HHS even tried to improve our food supply?
That's fair. Fair point.
Never. When have they ever tried to do anything to change the vaccine schedule or the approval process or any of that sort of stuff? Never. So give positive accolades for what has happened in a short period of time and keep respectful pressure to continue to do more.
I think that's a good way to look at it. And with respect to the Singapore thing too, luckily what we have retained, and I won't say this is a function of government because I personally, and I say this having been in the government before as an Army officer, went to West Point, refuse to attribute that which can be done by a group of people, whether that's a local community or people within a state or a region or the entire country for that matter, to government. And what I'm getting at is, there's still an air of freedom sentiments amongst the population of the United States to the degree that we have still retained our God-given rights to have guns and things like this, where people in Singapore have not. And it's not only the gun piece, but because that air of freedom exists, we are less... Singapore is further along in the steps towards tyranny because they've continued to believe that men and women in positions of so-called authority have the right to tell them what to do to the degree that is far greater than those of us in the United States. And because of that, yes, we should still be cautious not to end up there. But I think it will be much harder to end up there because the moment you go to a state in the Midwest or a state in the South in most cases and try to tell any of the people who live outside of the city, you must do this. What do they say? Hell no. Yeah, good luck, buddy. It's not going to happen. And even a lot of the so-called law enforcement are also on the same page, no, that's not going to happen. And now we should be cautious. And I don't disagree with you at all. I don't. But the point is that air of freedom to that degree still exists, and relative to Singapore, it's they're off a cliff,
I agree with you, but I would say that it's so important to keep building that up.
Yes,
because
agreed. Totally agree.
Look what happened during COVID.
Yeah.
I mean, I talked to somebody, this would have been probably in early 23 maybe, that they had just come back from a big thing in Europe. And that's when things were just starting to open up again. And she was at some government body position. I don't remember what exactly she went for, but what she said to me was so important. That what she said is, all the people that were there said, why did America roll over?
Right.
That it was because America rolled in 3 weeks. Yeah. Everybody put on masks, shut their doors, pulled their kids out, put masks on their 2-year-olds, and allowed all these Q-tips to be stuck up their noses and all that stuff. And she said that, all of these things, and I talk about that a lot in the book, Alec, is that all of the pandemics that have happened, along the way, like 1976 with the swine flu, and then 2005 bird flu, and then we did 2011 H1N1, and even with COVID, every single one of them have been market tests.
Yeah.
They throw this up, and tell you what you're going to do, what, going to get these shots, going to do these different things, until people like you, me, and other people say, wait a minute, stop. And then they back off. I mean, what happened to COVID? It ended like poof, it was just gone.
Yeah.
It
really did, though. It was wild.
It was just poof. It was just gone. And then what do they do during the next X number of years is they do data and analyze the data.
Yeah.
And so like, when you, just for example, look at COVID, it's like, and they look and they say what worked and what didn't work. And what didn't work during COVID? Free donuts, free beer, raffles for college education, lottery tickets, those little carrots out there. That didn't really work. What did work was weaponization of fear. And the more that we crank that up, even Fauci himself saying the problem with America is they're not afraid enough.
Yeah.
The more that we turn that fear crank, the more they're going to die and this is going to happen, then we got more people vaccinated.
I think it's like the way that they like overwhelm our nervous system, not even just via like so-called infectious disease. It's fear of terrorism. It's fear of this. It's fear at all angles. You look at a study that was put out in 2022, the second strongest risk factor for death associated with COVID, according to a study that was done on 540,000 people who were hospitalized and subsequently died with a COVID label. The second strongest risk factor for death was fear/anxiety related disorders.
Oh, well, for sure.
Yeah.
People, it was, and I said to so many people, and I said it on really big stages, I said it in front of a bunch of people. If the Bible says fear not more than 300 times, and God is going to bother to repeat himself that often, it must be pretty important.
Right.
And so, instead of turning that fear in giving it to the Lord and saying, I am so afraid, please take this cup from me, take it away, make me understand, where life is, where my life's going to be. We're all going to die here sometime, making sure your life's right with God and right with Jesus during the whole thing like that. We instead bowed a knee to the pharmaceutical industry to take away our fear. We thought, if we just get that shot, then I'm protected, then I don't have to worry, and I won't kill grandma. And, my kids won't die and all this other stuff. It told me where our country was or wasn't spiritually, because instead of taking our fear in prayer to the Lord, we went to the pharmaceutical industry, the pharmakia, and wanted to get this injection to keep us safe. And so that's a big problem.
Yeah.
It's a really, really big problem. And so, I've said a lot of times on a lot of different platforms and I've written a lot about it because I wrote another book called Walking with God. I wrote that during COVID, and I do a Sunday Substack every Sunday. That's my give back to the Lord on Sunday. It's called Tenpenny Walk with God.substack.com. And I said to people, you really need to repent over that. You really need to say, Lord, I made a big mistake here. I'm sorry. And you still may have to suffer the consequences of the injection, but you've cleaned it up with God by saying that you went to the pharmaceutical product instead of to him. And it's like, well, I was deceived and I thought I was doing the right thing. Well, you still made a mistake.
You still made the decision.
You were injected with something that defiled your temple, the temple of the Holy Spirit. Take it to God, clean it up, and then decide what you're going to have to do with your life. I agree with you to a certain degree when you say, well, people can clean up their injection process. Maybe. Because some things have, DNA's been changed, the turbo cancers.
I question the DNA change for sure, though, because I talked with Zach Bush about this recently, even looking into the whole genetics paradigm, there's a lot of questions there, especially as it pertains to epigenetics. So I do not think that something that was created by God can be altered to that degree by man. I just don't. I just refuse to believe it. I think God's intelligence is... We're
going to agree to disagree about that.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Because of the synthetic nature of what they created. I don't think they even started with a coronavirus. I think that they just thought that was just a convenient thing to name them. I think it was all synthetically made with the lipid nanoparticles and the polyethylene glycol inside of it and the HIV strips and the two different spike proteins and different things like that. I think it was all genetically defined. And if you're just going to take something, or genetically created, if you're just going to take a chemical that's been manipulated and added to and injected into the body with no previous thought to what's going to happen in the outcome. Who knows what's going to happen?
Yeah, no, I agree with that totally. And I think it was literally just a muck of poisonous substances that haven't
100%.
been introduced
I
before.
totally agree with that.
Definitely agree with that part.
So I tell people that, just clean it up with God. Say, I'm sorry. I was swept up in the moment. Don't let it happen again.
Yeah.
Just don't let it happen again. It's a spiritual battle that we're in.
Agreed.
That from your talk with your audience, we fight powers and principalities of this present darkness. We see all the creatures up there like Fauci and Birx and Collins and all those. We're not really fighting them.
No.
We're fighting the evil forces behind them.
Agree.
So if we know we're fighting evil forces, you need to put on the full armor of God and take your sins to the Lord. And he stands there, 1 John chapter 1, verse 9. He is standing there willing and wanting for us to come to him so he can forgive us. He's just, his job description is to love us. That's what he does.
Amen.
And so if he can...
Unconditionally.
Unconditionally.
Yep.
So if you made a mistake, and you violated the temple of the Holy Spirit, and you got sucked into all the fear-based stuff, clean it up.
Yeah.
Clean it up with God. And then maybe it'll clean up your body and give you the right ways to clean it up. I heard a pastor, well, he's not really a pastor. I don't know if you know Jamie Walden. Do you know Jamie? He's the best. I love Jamie. I listen to him every week. He used to be a Marine, and was a missionary, and he's just on fire for the Lord. He's on fire a lot. And he says, I tell people all the time, he said, if I had an affair with my wife and really made a mess of things, and then I went to my wife and said, I'm really sorry, and you made up and you got back together, there was always be something there that wasn't quite right. And he said, you can be right with the Lord and be forgiven with the Lord, but there's something not right in that relationship. So it's the same thing with the jabs. You can be right with the Lord, but maybe you've got some sort of injury. I mean, I talk about this in the book. 1.6 million people filed VAERS reports for vaccine injury. They estimate more than 2 billion people worldwide have been injured by the COVID jabs. And we know that there's millions of people that have died across the world because they don't have reporting systems like what we have. There's a lot of people that died. And so, with all of those people, if they've been injured, to various degrees, some people may have the ability to recover and some people don't. But you always have an opportunity to get it right with God.
Totally. And that's, I think, the larger point. And this goes back to the willingness to get the shots in the first place. And what I'm getting at is, I think for the people who understand that who they truly are is not this.
Right, exactly.
Their likelihood of being conditioned into being fearful of what happens to this by entities that are not God, by man instead, is much less than those who think that they're only a material being, that this is who they truly are, this physical thing that our soul is inhabiting is who they truly are, who worship scientism. Their likelihood, because their replacement for God is, you always worship something, in my opinion, right? And a lot of materialists, atheists would probably deny that statement, but whether they're willing to admit it or not, they believe that God doesn't exist. They believe that this universe was created from nothing, ultimately, many of them, right?
With the primordial Big Bang. Soup.
Yeah, exactly. And so the point is they're still adhering to a belief, and that belief ultimately stems from a bunch of presuppositions in quote, science, which is really just scientism. So they're also adhering to another form of religion themselves, and they've replaced what is naturally a belief in the Creator with a belief in man's nonsense that it is created to bastardize God. And so the people who are more likely to believe in something like that will end up doing these nonsensical things and get these products. And I think everything that you're saying here with our belief in God and our relying on God and fearing not is so incredibly important and pertinent to what's going on in the world right now. And it'll continue to be even more important moving forward too.
Exactly. And another thing, going back to the vaccine thing, is like we have lost our multi-generational family connection. In the 1950s or before, if you had a baby and the baby got sick, you'd go ask your mother or your grandmother, is this serious? Do I have to be concerned about this? And they go, they're okay.
Right.
Because they've seen it before. They raised
Totally.
you and maybe 7 other kids, and they've seen or they would go, that's kind of a concern. Maybe that's something that it needs to get checked out. We don't have that anymore. We've lost that family unit and that family structure that we've abdicated to the person over there in the white coat. The same thing that we were talking about abdicating over to the government.
Right.
And we've abdicated that to, I got to go see the pediatrician. Years ago, this was probably maybe 2002 or 3, something like that. I spoke at the Holistic Mom Association meeting in New Jersey. And, but all young moms, that were there. And at lunchtime, I went into the room. They had like 10 top round tables that were sitting there. So I just went and sat down with a group that was sitting there. We were just chatting. And nice young moms. And I said, I have a question for you guys. And I said, this is not a gotcha question. Because I'm not a young mom. I'm not even a mom. I don't even have kids. And so I have a question for you. Why do you think you need a pediatrician? And they all kind of sat there and kind of looked at each other, and nobody said anything. And finally, this one young gal from New York said, because everybody else has one.
Exactly.
And they all went, yeah, I think that's right, because it's my pediatrician, this and this and this, And I said, well, what if I told you don't need a pediatrician?
Right.
That you've got a mother and a grandmother or an aunt or a friend or something like that. I do believe that newborn babies, somewhere in the first probably 3 weeks of life, need to be checked out by a healthcare professional to just look for congenital hip dysplasia, to look for any congenital heart disease or anything that, because all there in the industry, about 10% of babies across the board are born with something called an inborn error of metabolism, that they just something didn't work right as they were developing. And I do believe that that needs to be picked up early, like PKU and things like that. But after that initial evaluation, you got a mom or a grandmom or a nurse or a practitioner or somebody that's raised kids in particular, or maybe you, because you've had multiple kids,
Got 3.
And kids, parents are obviously more concerned of the first one because they've not done this before.
Right.
And so it's the reliance on people around you, friends, family members that have raised kids, that if something's not acting right with the baby, go and ask them. They've seen it before, and they're going to be able to say, no, that's okay. Or watch them for 24 hours. If they don't perk up, then maybe, we can do something. So you need some sort of advice of people that have raised children.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be a person in a white coat.
100%.
And I think that the whole profession of pediatrics they don't do what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to, doctor is supposed, in Greek, means teacher. So you're supposed to teach new parents that have never had a baby before about what things to watch for. When do you introduce these foods? This is what milestones are. I mean, you can print off of the internet the growth charts. So mom stands on the scale and looks at the weight. Dad hands her the baby. You look at the weight. That's what the weight of the baby is, right? You can learn, pretty easily how to do the measurements to make sure and chart them on the thing. It's not rocket science.
I will say we didn't even do any of that stuff with our kids because we just trusted that God made them and we're taking care of them in a healthy, natural way, and they're going to be fine, and they've been fine. Like, they're totally fine. Well, I'm not saying that my way is the way, and not at all. I'm just saying what I've done.
Well, I'm just saying that these sorts of ways, because, to look for microcephaly and growth patterns and stuff like that, it's super simple. You don't need to be a healthcare professional, a doctor. You don't need any of that.
The point is you don't need someone in a white coat to tell you what to do with your kid, and we've lost our communal...
If you're tracking the growth chart and they're way down here at the 20%, and they're not acting right.
Right.
And if you understand a little bit, buy some books.
Right.
Mendelssohn's book from the 70s, I believe it is, that, Mendelssohn's book, How to Raise a Healthy Child in Spite of Your Pediatrician, still applies. Yeah. And so there's lots of tools that you can do that you don't need to abdicate to somebody in the white coat.
Amen. Most healthcare today operates on an outdated, mechanistic model, treating the body like a battlefield rather than a self-healing system. You wait months for an appointment only to receive a rush diagnosis that labels you rather than truly understanding your unique health. Even in holistic health, many practitioners rely on endless lab tests and supplement protocols, addressing symptoms instead of the root cause. And the result? Another prescription or supplement regimen that merely suppresses or masks symptoms rather than facilitating true healing, whether the imbalance was physical, emotional, energetic, or a mix of all three. And that's why Dr. Tom Cowan co-founded the New Biology Clinic, to offer something radically different. As one of the most respected natural health doctors in the world, Dr. Cowan has spent decades challenging conventional medicine and advancing a deeper understanding of human biology, water, and natural health. His work isn't just about rejecting the mainstream, it's about offering a more truthful, biologically coherent approach for healing. The New Biology Clinic recognizes that health isn't about fighting disease, it's about restoring balance. You're not a diagnosis, you're an individual with a unique story, and healing should honor that. With virtual consultations available worldwide, the clinic offers a flat-rate monthly membership that gives you direct access to practitioners who take the time to actually listen. Members also get exclusive health live streams, a resource library, and live sessions covering everything from biofield tuning and breathwork to movement and meditation, all designed to support whole body healing. And if you're not ready for a membership, you can book a one-time appointment, sign up for an enrichment-only membership for the healing modalities alone, or schedule a free connection session with one of the care team members to see how the New Biology Clinic can help in your specific situation. This isn't about keeping you dependent on doctors. It's about making you sovereign over your health. Head to newbiologyclinic.com and use code THEWAYFORWARD, and that's spelled The Way, F-O-R-W-A-R-D, for $50 off account activation, or just head to the show notes for more info. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com for $150 off. Your body already knows how to heal, and New Biology Clinic helps you remember. So we brought up Dr. Chris Exley earlier, and I cannot recommend checking out his work enough. Like it is illuminating. His
book is called Mr. Aluminum.
Of course it is.
It's really good, and it's not real thick, but it's very readable.
Yeah,
it's a really good book.
Yeah. And so I was incorrect on the amount of micrograms of aluminum you receive, and I meant to look up the figure while we were just on a break, but that's okay. I'll throw it in the show notes. The exact amount that a baby receives by 1 year of age, and then 18 years of age for a child, how much micrograms of aluminum you can expect to receive if you're following the CDC childhood poison schedule, as we'll call it.
Well, now, yes, I got to get you trained to say that.
Exactly. I mean, I agree 100%. There is absolutely no necessity to receive these. But nonetheless, for those who are just coming to understand this paradigm, the one thing that I do want to discuss a little bit is aluminum itself. So from my understanding, and please correct me on this if I'm incorrect, Dr. T, the CDC and the World Health Organization cite studies primarily in which aluminum is ingested in order to make the claim that aluminum is safe when injected. And the form of aluminum we're talking about here comes in the form of so-called vaccine adjuvants intended to, quote, stimulate the immune system in order to get it to, quote, recognize the dead virus that it is accompanied with, which is a bunch of absurd presuppositions on how the human body works to begin with, but we're going to set that aside. But nonetheless, it's aluminum hydroxide and aluminum phosphate. And from my understanding, they make the claim that it is safe when injected by citing studies in which it was ingested and or citing this one specific study. I think it was called the Mitkis study in 2011, where it was an algorithmic assumption-based study in order to make the claim that the level of aluminum children receive when following the vaccine schedule at that time was safe. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that or anything that I've said is incorrect, but
I don't know that study that you cited. I'm not familiar with that.
I'll send it to you after this.
I do know that you're correct that they make the assumption because you can eat it, you can inject it.
Yeah.
Gary Matsumoto wrote a really good book probably in the 90s. It was called Vaccine A, and it was about the anthrax vaccine.
Yeah.
And there's a quote that he said in there that I always go back to on the difference between ingesting and injecting. And he said, I can eat a hamburger and be okay, but if I put it in the blender and injected it into my arm, I don't think I'd feel so well in the morning. And that's kind of,
Right.
kind of like points that out. I think it's, a good way to maybe talk about adjuvants is how they started. They started in the 1920s when they were developing the diphtheria toxoid, and then the tetanus toxoid. And they developed that from horse blood. And they used all sorts of things. They trialed all sorts of things. I talk about, there's a big section in the book about that, that they tried breadcrumbs and alum, and not alum. They tried breadcrumbs, cornstarch. They tried all sorts of things to make this inflammatory reaction so that they could get more of the toxoid, the toxin to inject to create the toxoid from. And then they stumbled across aluminum, and they thought that was the best, and it was inert and it wasn't going to cause any problems. Inert.
Yeah.
And so that's when they started using aluminum in the vaccines. And if you read any paper now, that even published in the last few years that talks about aluminum, they'll say, we've been using this since the 1920s. We still don't know how it works.
Wild.
And it's in publication. They say it all the time. We still don't know exactly how it works. We think it's supposed to, when you inject a vaccine, the aluminum is supposed to be in the muscle that's supposed to hold the antigen there long enough so that the B cells can go by and get little pieces of it and create antibodies. We think that's how it works. That's called the depot method. Mm-hmm. And we think that's how it works. We're not really sure. And then there's other sorts of ways that they are sort of guessing how it works. But this is a product they inject in large quantities into babies that by their own admission, they still don't know how it works. I go into a lot of that when I talk about all the adjuvants and the new because they went from aluminum to MF59. Which is an oil-based adjuvant that's highly inflammatory and highly toxic. It was first in the anthrax vaccine. This is what Gary Matsumoto wrote about in his book, Vaccine A. And then that was extremely toxic. And now it's approved for two different flu shots, one for infants and one for the elderly.
Wow.
Is MF59. And then they went to this ASO system, which is put together by, I think that just stands for Adjuvant System something. And I don't remember off the top of my head the exact name, but it's ASO 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Wow.
All different ingredients in there, made by GlaxoSmithKline, extremely toxic. I believe it's ASO 4 is made from tree bark and from the bacteria, the cell wall of the salmonella bacteria. And who is the first bright person that thought injecting particles of tree bark into a human would...
For any of this, like monkey kidney cell culture,
yeah, and so, but that's
it's all
extremely toxic. And so when I tell people a lot when we're talking about this, I said, if you have to get a vaccine, if you're forced to by the military, you're in the military, or ordered by the court, if you end up over there because you're in a toxic divorce sort of thing, or something like that, please do your best to not get a shot that's manufactured by GlaxoSmithKline. And how you know that is that it usually ends in RIX, like Pediarix, Boosterix, Fluorix, all those things. They've sort of trademarked that RIX is made by GlaxoSmithKline. So when you go to your doctor or you end up someplace where you have to get a shot, ask them, what brand do you carry in the office? And then, try to make some decisions that way. Sometimes you're just in a situation where you're just forced and you can't say no. Mm-hmm. And so I go into a lot of detail about all the different adjuvants in the book. And I talk about also the different cell lines that are made from like tumor cells. Yeah. They use tumor cells to grow these virus things, and but they're using cancerous cells. Yep. That those cells end up in the vials that are injected into people.
Yep.
And then there's a big thing on cow blood, and how I even stumbled across that is that
You're talking about fetal bovine serum specifically?
Fetal bovine serum, but really cow blood, because I was making a table that I was putting all the names of all the vaccines across the top, and I was making a list down the side of all the different ingredients, and I wanted to create a matrix to show how many micrograms of all this stuff is in a single vial. And as I'm going through the package inserts, I'm seeing that it says fetal bovine serum, cow serum, immature cow serum, and there's like 7 or 8 different cow things. And I looked at that and I thought, there must be something different about these, or why wouldn't they just say serum, bovine serum? Right. Why would they list them with different names? So I started looking at it, and it is so disgusting. It is the most disgusting thing about this vaccine stuff, of how they get this cow serum from these fetal cows, is that generally there's a cow that they end up for either thinning the herd, or it's sick or something like that, because they don't take female cows and put it into the food supply. Those are male cows, right? So, but they end up sending it to the butcher place, and as they kill this cow, they find out that it's pregnant. And before it's completely pregnant, there's a little fetus in there of a little baby cow. They take a large bore syringe and jam it into the heart of that little fetus cow and suck out all of its blood, and that's how they kill it. And then they spin it off, and is fetal bovine serum. And they take the red blood cells and the white blood cells out in the serum, and it's very expensive. And almost every viral vaccine has fetal bovine serum in it.
I added that too, because not only that, but in all of modern cell biology in scientific labs, this is what is used as a nutrient serum for the cells.
Yes.
This substance.
Yeah. And then why they name it different things is it's based on the age of the fetus. Because if it's a larger fetus, the cow was almost full term, which is, I believe, 10 months, they can get more blood out of it.
It's disgusting. It's unbelievable.
It's so disgusting.
It's demonic. It's
literally
very
demonic.
Yeah,
it's the
demonic.
blood sacrifice part of what these vaccines are.
Yes, it is.
It's so disgusting. And then they do the same thing with the chicken fibroblasts, that they take these little chickens and how they mangle them and mash them all up. It's so disgusting.
Yeah.
And once you understand some of these things, why on God's earth would you ever inject any of that stuff into a human? I'll say, most of these vaccines, you wouldn't even want to inject into your neighbor's cat that you hate.
Right.
Why would you put it into your own child that you love?
Right.
Amen.
So well said. It really is it's demonic in many ways.
And very much is.
And I know Rudolf Steiner had several quotes dating back to the early 20th century talking about how that was the intention of the whole vaccine paradigm, was to separate the human being from its true essence, from its soul.
There's another thing that I stumbled across when I was making that chart. And again, I talk about this in detail in the books too. Can I mention my book?
Yeah,
it's called Zero Accountability in a
I said it at the beginning, but go ahead again. Yeah,
it's zero accountability in a failed system, how Big Pharma weaponizes vaccines, public health, and the law. It took me about a little over a year to write it, but that's 25 years worth of work that goes into that. So we really hope and people have enjoyed reading it. It's interesting because I've been rereading it to get the factoids back in my head, and I find myself yellow highlighting places. It's like, Sherri, it's your own book.
You wrote it. I literally wrote this.
Yeah.
I get that.
But the eggs are, again, I was reading the package insert, and it said specific pathogen-free eggs. And I'm reading it, and my eye go back. Specific pathogen-free. What are specific pathogen-free eggs? Well, it's an entire industry. It's a huge industry. They use 500,000 eggs every week because they need to make 76 to 80 million flu shots. And it's at a crop of 500,000 a week. And these are chickens grown in specific purification hatcheries. Their eggs are handled in a specific way, and they are tested for a list of approximately 30 different pathogens. And if those eggs are found to be pure from those pathogens, they are called specific pathogen-free eggs. So the eggs are not pathogen-free. They're specific pathogen-free, meaning they have this list of pathogens are not in the eggs, and those are the eggs that we will take to make flu shots. Now, at the very beginning of COVID, I remember hearing Dr. Judy Mikovits talking about that people were already pre-injected with coronaviruses before COVID, and so they were going to, have a severe reaction once they got injected with these jabs. And I thought, is that true? So I pulled out the list of the test of pathogens that they test these eggs for, because coronaviruses are endemic in chickens. They're sort of like having yeast cells on our surface of our skin, that they're symbiotic pathogens, and they're just there. So coronaviruses are endemic in chickens, and they're just part of chickens. And sure enough, they don't test for coronaviruses on that list. So the coronaviruses from the chicken are going to end up in the eggs that are going to end up in your flu shot that's going to be injected into your body. So then you get a COVID jab, and then you end up with something called antibody enhancement. And that's what causes all the anaphylaxis and caused a lot of people to die early on. If you remember, at the very beginning of when they released the COVID shots, particularly in the UK, when they're using AstraZeneca over there, all of the flu shot stations all had to have crash carts, because so many people were having anaphylactic reactions. It's because they already had that coronavirus in them, and then they were injected, and they had antibody-dependent enhancement that just made everything worse all at the same time.
Could we talk about some other ingredients too, like polysorbate 80 as well? That's another one, and I'm sure you go into that in the book as well. Yeah. What do you know about polysorbate 80?
Everybody's exposed to it. It's sort of like polyethylene glycol, which is really bad. They use it in frosting, and they use it when they make drugs because it's a flow agent. It's just.
But again, there's a difference between being exposed to it and then having it injected into you too, though.
Right.
Yeah. Is there like any toxicity information you know about that one specifically?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other thing that is important to contextualize for the audience too is the lack of studies on synergistic effects between the various ingredients, not only in one vaccine that you're receiving, because you also have to take into account that children are administered multiple vaccines at once. So not only are they not considering the synergistic effects in one single vaccine, but between the ingredients in multiple vaccines that are administered at one time. Do you have anything to add to that?
And the other thing that they've never done is they've never tested for antibodies against any of these chemicals or against any of the other ingredients in there that may turn into something called molecular mimicry. Molecular mimicry is I created this antibody to go against this particle. Now, if there's no particle, what is this antibody going to do? It finds a sequence of amino acids on different organ systems that go, well, that looks pretty similar to this thing over here. I'll go and attack that. Whether it's the synovia in your joints, whether it's your liver, whether it's your pancreas, whether it's your brain tissue, whether it's all those things, that's called molecular mimicry. Now, because we don't have any idea if all of these things that are injected at the same time, the fetal bovine serum is a protein, so your body's going to create an antibody against that protein and against the chicken fibroblasts, against the other chemicals and things that are in your system. We have no idea how inflammatory we are creating inside of the body when all of these things are injected.
Yeah, it's unbelievable to think about it like that too. Like literally no clue what actually occurs inside the human body when it comes to any of these things. I think that the other two big points that I want to discuss to sort of wrap things up, there's so much more when it comes to this, because we could get into how corrupt the FDA, the CDC are historically, the FDA being that 75% of its drug regulatory budget comes from the same companies that it regulates. And then you get into the history of all these companies, how much Congress receives when it comes to lobbying as it pertains to the pharmaceutical industry relative to other industries. We're going to set all those conversations aside. There's so much to be said just on those topics. They could be episodes in and of themselves. But the other things that I want to talk about are specifically the lack of studies comparing fully vaccinated children to fully unvaccinated children coming from the so-called authorities. Now, I want to caveat by saying those studies, some of them, very limited, do exist by the likes of Dr. Paul Thomas, Dr. James Lyons Wheeler, and other people like this, but coming from the so-called I refuse to call them authorities. The so-called authorities, I guarantee you they have that data on hand. I guarantee it. But they have not demonstrated that these products or the schedule itself is safe whatsoever, because they've never compared a population of people who have received none of them to a population of people who have received all of them. And I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Two things. One is there's a book, I admit I have it, but I haven't read it, by Dr. Brian Hooker called Vaxxed versus Unvaxxed. Mm-hmm. And that got started because, he works for Children's Health Defense. And that was when Bobby Kennedy was still with Children's Health Defense. And he called up Brian and he said, can you find any studies at all that show vax versus unvaxxed? And Brian thought, well, this ought to be easy. I can maybe find 6. There's like 200.
Wow.
And so Brian said it just like blew his mind that there were so many. Now, I've got a copy of that book, but I admit that I haven't read it. So I can't give you any more details than that. But the title of that book for your listeners is Vaxxed versus Unvaxxed. So it's out there. And the reason that they haven't done any of that is because the supposed powers that be, like you said.
I just refuse. I cannot, I refuse to acknowledge them as legitimate authorities.
They look at that as an unethical study because you're withholding a therapy of known value from this set of kids who are unvaxxed, and you can't withhold an MMR or a DPT or hepatitis A or whatever vaccine that you're trialing from those kids because you're endangering their life by not vaccinating them. And so that's called to create a study of unvaccinated children versus vaccinated is considered unethical.
Yeah, that's what's called begging the question or circular reasoning, and that's a logical fallacy because the whole point of an unvaccinated versus vaccinated study is to determine the safety, but they're already presupposing that these products are safe, which is the excuse they come up with to rescue them from having to validate it in the first place.
A product of known value, right?
Yeah, how is it a product of known value if
because it prevents you from getting sick, and if they don't get these vaccines, they're going to get sick and they will die.
Right. That's what they say. Yeah, it's absurd. It's absolutely
really
absurd. And I think, again, I've discussed this in other episodes. This is where it would behoove of people to understand the importance of logical fallacies because that's quite literally what they're doing right there. They're using circular reasoning, or they're begging the question that these products are already determined to be safe. Therefore, they don't need to prove that they're safe, but they've never determined that in the first place. They're just presupposing that. I think this is the biggest, most important piece because this is why this movement, in my opinion, has grown to this level. Yes, it's great that you've spoken and other people have spoken, but it's the moms. It's the moms who have sounded the alarm, who
or
have
the
had
dads.
Or the dads. Yes, dads too, but there's something about a mother's intuition, I'll put it that way.
Right.
Like my own wife, shout out to her. Her intuition is incredibly strong. It's wild. Just a quick aside, as of this recording, a lot of stuff is going on between Israel and Iran. I don't want to get into that right now, but it is pretty wild. This morning, my wife woke up and told me, I had a dream last night that there was missiles being fired, and she had no clue about what was going on. And I told her, and she was like, I'm freaking out right now. My wife tends to have pretty prophetic dreams. So yeah, there's something about a mother's intuition specifically. But that being said, whether it's a mom or a dad, the amount of parents who have witnessed their own child regress after receiving multiple products at once, or, a few weeks after receiving multiple products at once in many cases as well, sometimes a few months. But the point is, witness their healthy baby receive multiple products at once and then drastically regress. And many of those children are now young adults who still live at home, who are in diapers. Sometimes it's not that dire, but nonetheless are injured.
And they can't speak.
They can't speak, and it's horrible.
It's terrible.
And what I'm getting at is, you've been doing this for a long time, Dr. T. How many mothers do you think you've talked to who have had this story, who were gaslighted by the mainstream medical paradigm, whose doctor, when they tried to show up to their pediatrician office and say, look, hey, last week I came in for my well baby checkup with my son. he was talking, making eye contact before, and what could this be caused by the shots? And then we're gaslighted, sometimes kicked out of that pediatric practice. How many moms do you think you've talked to, or just parents in general over the years, who have had a story like this?
Thousands.
Yeah.
Either I've spoken to directly, or I've interacted with them online, or they've sent me a text or an email, or they've been in contact with my staff. Thousands. And there's this story that I tell. Early on in my practice, there was a young mom that came in, had a little boy, that was clearly vaccine injured, not severely, but a little. And I just remember her saying to me, when Michael and I got pregnant, we were so excited, and we investigated everything. We looked at formula versus breast. We looked at mobiles over top of the bassinet. We looked at car seats. We looked at everything we could think of. It never once occurred to us to investigate vaccines. And when she was telling me that, she was all teary-eyed, because they had trusted the pediatrician, assumed that the pediatrician knew. And, what ended up resulted was their child was injured. I've heard that story, and it always haunts me to think about that more times than I can count. It's one of the things that drives me, because I've always said this will never be a top-down solution. It has got to be a groundswell. And, the powers that be, their responses, this was back in 2000, maybe 14 and 15, when we were really making, I believe that we were really making ground. This is when they started publishing a lot of studies about vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah.
And that some of those studies were showing up to 60% of parents were questioning vaccines. Some of them were questioning just the number of vaccines, and did I have to get all these? They weren't even anti-vaccine parents, a lot of them. They were just like, do I have to get all these at the same time? Can't we do like one at a time?
Well, they've changed the definition of that too. So those parents would now in the modern times be considered anti-vax, because it's anyone who even questions vaccines,
a little bit.
Which is insane.
But they were, some of those parents in those studies weren't even saying no. They were just saying, do I have to do so many? There was only a small set of parents in those studies that actually said no to all of them. But the number of parents that were questioning was getting larger and larger and larger. And what was the response to that? They started taking, SB 277, SB 276, and now 5 states have removed the religious exemptions. A couple more, removed the philosophical exemptions. And so that's the response to, if you question, we're going to take away your right to refuse and make you poison your children. Mm-hmm. Make you poison your children. That should resonate in people's heads.
Right. Right. And luckily, again, there's ways around that. And because the cat is, I won't say fully out of the bag, but falling out of the bag, continuing to come out of the bag.
Jumping out of the bag.
Jumping out of the
halfway
bag.
Out of the bag.
Yeah. In the midst of slowly jumping out of the bag. I don't know what to call it, but I think that you can't put a lid on this anymore. Like, so many people are learning the truth about this paradigm that,
I call that, Alec, I call that the gift of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
That one of the gifts of COVID was that, people have seen the carnage caused by that jab. Yeah. Number one. Number two, people still got pregnant and had babies during that period of time, and they didn't go to their pediatrician, who refused to see them or wanted to see them sitting in their car and all kinds of, or they didn't have any health insurance, and so they didn't go. The kid's now 3, didn't die, isn't sick, and they're getting ready to have another baby. They're like, well, he didn't have any vaccines, so maybe the second one doesn't need it either. Mm-hmm. Doesn't need any either. And so that is one of the gifts, many of the gifts of COVID. The other, I also think that one of the gifts of COVID is that it woke people up to the corruption of government, that we got the government we deserve because we took our hands off the steering wheel. And so it woke up the corruption to that, woke up the extreme corruption inside the healthcare industry. and the medical complex that doesn't know anything except symptom pill, symptom pill, symptom pill.
Yep.
And so I think that they overplayed their hand.
Yes.
And what they were expecting to be the outcome of this was of total submission has turned up to be total revolt.
Yeah.
And I love that.
I love it too. I love it too. And it's thanks to people like you and so many other people who I've interviewed on this podcast that this information continues to be shared, and then these seeds continue to find themselves in fertile ground to grow, and this is just continuing to explode. And again, I want to reemphasize it's because of the people. Yes, it's great whatever happens inside government, like to help dismantle corruption there, like good on you. I hope that continues to happen, of course. And as long as we, the people, the men and women of not only the United States, but across the world, I know I have a lot of listeners in Australia and Canada and England and all over the place. But if we stop buying into that system and opt out en masse, it's like the Wizard of Oz. They really don't have any more power, but it requires that we have that strong connection with God, or if you believe in something greater than yourself at the least, and connection with each other, and in our standing shoulder to shoulder with those around us who are on the same page, and really get hyper local and find your local community. I think that's vitally important right now too. Do you have time for one more question? Is that
Sure,
okay?
yeah.
Okay. So another big thing related to injury, and I think this may be inherently anecdotal or speculative. Maybe there are studies pertaining to this. I don't know. But sudden infant death syndrome, that's another big one that I come from the position that I think in the overwhelming majority, if not all cases, it's a result of being poisoned by vaccines. But what have you come across related to SIDS?
Well, Vera Shribner wrote the book about that. She used to, I believe that was in the 80s, maybe even a little before that, but it sticks in my mind it was the 80s, where she did all the research. She's out of Australia, and she did, she called it cot death, and actually tracked that from when babies got these shots at 2 months, so many of the cot deaths happened at 3 months. Or they got 2 and 4 month shots, and then the cot death was at 5 months. And she tracked it, and she used, and she also was one of the early users, and she maybe even helped develop it. Those cribs, those crib things that monitor your baby's respiration at night. You know, those breath. They call them breath monitors, I guess. So this data has been around for a long time. It's just been shoved aside. So, that had nothing to do with it. It was the defective child, you know. There's something wrong with that baby, and he was going to die anyways, because that's what they said. The CDC actually said that they got all these shots, and they got a seizure disorder, an autoimmune disorder, a neurological problem, myoclonic jerks, or SIDS. Wasn't the vaccine? It was inevitable, and they were going to happen anyways.
Wow.
CDC information, Pink Book, the 6th edition of that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And that also brings up the last important point related to vaccine injury itself. So Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare put out a study, I want to say in the mid 2010s, maybe the early 2000s, I don't remember exactly, that found that less than 1% of vaccine adverse events were reported at that time. Now, I think that a lot more people are hip to this, but nonetheless, when parents are conditioned to believe anything that occurs just after a vaccine is fundamentally not related to the vaccine, when doctors are trained not to look for vaccine injury, are trained to believe that they're safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective over and over and over again, you're not going to recognize what is obviously slapping you in the face a vaccine injury, and it's not going to be reported. And even there are so many other problems we could discuss with VAERS, but the point is vaccine injury is incredibly common. It occurs, I would estimate, thousands and thousands on a daily basis, really.
Every vaccine causes an injury.
Yeah.
Whether it's overt or subtle. You know, every single one.
Mm-hmm.
And when pediatricians say, I've never seen a vaccine injury, It's because you never asked the question, and you wouldn't believe it if it came up and shook your hand.
Yeah.
Because it can't happen from a vaccine. Well, then the question is, have you even read a package insert, doctor? Do you even know what you're injecting into these babies? It's pretty bad.
Yeah,
It's really
and most
bad.
haven't, and it's crazy. But okay, I want to be respectful of your time, Dr. T. Thank you so much for sitting with me. And again, if you're interested in her book, Zero Accountability in a Failed System: How Big Pharma Weaponizes Vaccines, Public Health, and the Law, that will be available in the show notes. Do you have anything you want to share to close up?
You can, if you want to see any more of the stuff that we do, my website is drtenpenny.com. If you want to join us and become a member of our organization, you can go to shop10penny.net and click on the membership. You can follow me on X at Busy Dr. T, at Busy Dr. T. We do podcasts 5 days a week at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And we post on our Substack 7 days a week. I write a Substack on Saturday called Eye on the Evidence. And on Sunday, I write my Walking with God Substack. But we post little short things for people to read every single day. So we're really super busy. So any of your support would be much appreciated. And stay strong. Just say no. Just say no.
Love it. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, Dr. T.
Thank you so much for having me.